What a great time of worship this morning. How wonderful is our God. How great is our God. Thank you, Chad, praise team, choir, all of our musicians. Ephesians chapter 6 this morning. Ephesians chapter 6. Beginning a brand new series this morning entitled Generational Discipleship. Generational Discipleship. I want to begin teaching you over the next several weeks, primarily from the book of Deuteronomy, but I'm going to give you some introduction this morning. I'm going to be talking to us as a church about how you can impact your families, about how we can impact this next generation that is coming about. I say coming about, they're already here. They're here with us now. How are we going to impact this culture and those who are looking at us? Generational discipleship. I've already told you this morning we'll be in Ephesians chapter 6, but it's going to take us a little while to get there. Now, don't let me scare you, because it's going to be a while before we get there. But then when I get there, don't think, man, he's going to go another 30 minutes. No, we're going to still get out at the same time, but you got to hang with him this morning. I'm going to really try to help you. I'm going to try to help you and your home. If you're a father or a mother this morning, if you're a grandparent this morning, if you're an aunt or an uncle, if you have influence over anybody, I'm going to really try to help you this morning. I want to start out this morning telling you about some mistakes that I believe the church has made. My good friend, Dr. Ron Hunter, who's the executive director of Randall House Publications, he and I were talking just this summer, spent a long time together at a meeting we were at, and spent a long time talking about this very subject. And he is determined that he believes churches have made some mistakes. Mistake number one that churches have made, churches have put all their effort into what happens at church. Let me say that again, and I want you to think as I'm talking. Churches put all their efforts into what happens during this hour. Let me introduce to you a thought this morning. It's the 1/168 principle is what we call it. If you took all the hours in a week, there's 168 hours in a week. For many Christians, all the effort they get spiritually is in this 1 hour in 168 hours a week. Let's talk about that. There's those 168 hours. There's a red dot right here that doesn't show up real well. But that's 1 in 168 hours. Let me just tell you quite frankly, it's not enough. If that's all you're doing as a Christian, it's not enough. I love to play golf. I just don't get to play very much. I don't have an opportunity to play near as much as I like to. What's frustrating to me is when I get opportunity to go play golf and I walk out on the course and generally I have a bad game. Why? Because I'm not playing. In order to be good in the game of golf, you got to play. And you got to play, and you got to play, and you got to play, and you got to practice a lot. And it's still hard to be good at the game of golf, even if you practice. But 1 out of 168 hours, it's not enough. Let's go ahead and look at this a little bit further. The red represents the period of time we spend in church. If we color in some more hours, that's the amount of hours you sleep. So those hours are already gone. You're not going to be doing much discipleship and learning about Jesus while you're sleeping. Now, I did have a God experience night before last during my sleep. Kim is out of town. And about 1:30 in the morning, I get that horrible sound, Dad! So you can experience God at 1:30 in the morning during your sleep. But the green represents the sleep time during that week. If you go to the blue, if you're a student, or represents maybe even work, if you go to that blue, that represents time that you're in school. Or maybe we could probably increase it a little bit more for those of us who are employed. You go on further. The orange represents time when we're entertained. When we're, especially students and children, they're doing something on TV, or they're playing a game, or we're on what they call this digital rectangle. These are taking over what we used to say kids spend time on video games. Adults, let's don't amen too hard. We waste a lot of time there also, don't we? But that's where we are. And just let me tell you, 1 in 168, let me reemphasize to you, the white represents the home influence. That's a time when we're just at home, and there could be some time spent doing something edifying and Christ-like. But let me tell you, 1 in 168, it's not enough. 1 in 168. Listen, we want to correct this type of mistake. Churches put all their efforts into what happens at church. Listen, do you want your grandchild or your child to have a biblical worldview? Then our generational discipleship strategy must involve parents. It's going to have to involve parents. Let me talk to you. Whether we realize it or not, or whether you like it or not, the truth is, parents are still the greatest influencers on our children. We're still the greatest. Parents determine how a child manages their money. Parents usually determine the traditions of holidays, what you do at Thanksgiving or Christmas or any of those type things. Parents determine the significance of other events. Think about how you celebrate a birthday. Parents usually set the tone for that. Parents determine how a child views authority. Let me tell you what, if you as an adult undermine authority, whether that authority is a parent or a teacher or a law enforcement or whatever authority is over us, if you as an adult undermine authority, guess what your child is going to do? They're going to undermine authority. Let me tell you what, therein lies the problems with our school systems today. Therein lies the problem with crime rates today. Therein lies all the social ills of this world today. Parents who undermine authority. The Bible is very clear on authority. Let me tell you what, everyone answers to someone. I'm telling you, everybody answers to someone. But the mistake our churches are making is that we put all the effort into this 1 hour. Let me ask you something this morning. Who is shaping the worldview of your child? Who's shaping the worldview of your child? Is it MTV? Ooh, I hope not. Is it the Kardashians? Boy, I hope not. Or are the digital rectangles shaping your child's worldview? Let me tell you what, if we sit back and do nothing, I can guarantee those things will shape our children's worldview. It will. You say, well, Pastor, what is a worldview? Explain that to me. Well, some have said the fundamental perspective from which one addresses every issue in life. Listen, they will not get a biblical worldview. Listen to me. They will not get a biblical worldview in 1 hour a week. It will not happen. I promise you that. 1 hour a week. they're not going to get it. So I challenge us. We've got to correct that problem. You see, when we start talking about worldview, what's right and what's wrong, or what are we seeing out of this eye, and what are we seeing out of this eye? We see right and wrong, and then there's God there. Listen, our generational discipleship strategy must begin to involve more parents. Listen, parents of students. And when I say students, I'm referring to 12 and up, 12 to 18, our teenagers, as we used to refer to it, but now refer to them usually as students. Listen, I am telling you as your pastor, Brick and Allison are not responsible for the spiritual well-being of my children. God's going to ask me about that, and I'm telling you, moms and dads, we've got to get us, I'm pointing the finger right at me. We got to get us more involved in the youth ministry of this church and involved, and don't just say, well, Brick, you take a bus and you go. I'm telling you, it's not going to happen if that's the kind of strategy we're going to use. We have got to get more parental involvement. Let me tell you about mistake number 2. I told you it'd be a long introduction. It's not really an introduction. It's just part 1 of the sermon. How about it? Does that sound better? Mistake number 2. Churches put all their efforts into what happens. That's wrong. Churches operate like a lot of smaller churches within itself, but each are very independent, is what that should say. Let me give you this. Let me tell you what that means. You got the church, and many years ago, we decided that we're going to start a senior saints ministry over here. Then we started a youth ministry over here. Now we have a Mickey Mouse head on our church. Then we said, well, we probably need to start a college ministry. And then we said, oh, okay, now we got a children's ministry over here. And now we've got to have a family ministry. And you got all these ministries laying on the outside of the church, doing their own thing, operating independently, and we're never together doing the same things. And we're wondering, what has happened? Let me show you what we've got to do. We got to get all these things within the church. Now, I am all for doing some different things, and we're trying some different things, even with our student ministries right now. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to point them more to parental involvement. Listen, we have got to be more involved. So this mistake number 2, we've got to get rid of that one. We got to all be moving together and not separately and independently. Let me tell you about mistake number 3. Churches fail to hire the unseen staff member. Let me tell you what the unseen staff member is. The unseen staff member is what and how we teach. What and how we teach. Listen, that's why we've been intentional in this change on our Sunday morning life group curriculum. This is why I will preach beginning next Sunday night. I will be preaching in the same vein as the things you're learning on a Sunday morning life groups. So what you get at 9:45, I'm going to be teaching in that same realm on Sunday night. Listen, that's why a multitude of resources are involved in this new curriculum we're using. All ages studying the same passage. So when I go home with my 6th grade son this afternoon, I can say, hey, what did you talk about? And I will have studied the exact same thing, and I will have preached in the exact same vein. So for parents and grandparents, it gives you a platform to have real life discussions. That's where discipleship takes place. This new curriculum gives us devotionals for all ages and personal devotion guides. It puts us all on the same page. That's also why Brick has implemented a 7-year teaching strategy for students that we are following now. A 7-year teaching strategy. It's 7 essential things that we believe every student needs to be taught between the age of 12 and 18. And when they leave Bethel Church's teen ministry, they have been taught those 7 key principles over and over and over during their years as a teenager. Mistake number 3. Churches fail to hire the unseen staff member. We must correct these types of thinking. Now, let's look at the passage in Ephesians 6. In the remainder of our time, I want us to look at Ephesians 6. Throughout this series in Deuteronomy 5 and 6, Ephesians 6 is a parallel passage in the New Testament. In the New Testament, as always, it generally goes a step further in the thinking. It is no different here. Paul goes to another level in thinking. Deuteronomy 6, several things about generational discipleship, and it says a lot about how parents are to raise and guide their children. Now, Paul in the New Testament is bringing up some new things and taking those things a step further. Look with me in Ephesians 6 and verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. And fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Let me tell you point number one this morning out of these 4 verses. Children have an obligation to their parents. Children have an obligation to their parents. Listen to me, students, during this segment right here. You have some obligations. Look at those first 2 verses. And you're going to say, man, I have heard this all my life. Okay, but here's what I want you to get. You've heard it, but are we doing it? Here's the 2 things it says in those first 2 verses. Number 1, the obligation a child has to their parent is to obey. Obey. It's a simple word. This refers to the action. This is an action word. Obey. What does that mean, Pastor? It simply means this. Do what your parents say. It's obeying. Students, when you are obeying your parents, when you look at the word here in the original language, it is the same as if you are obeying God. When you obey your parents, it's the same as obeying God himself. There is really no middle ground here, or no wiggle room, as I like to say. We are commanded to obey our parents. You're commanded by God numerous times to obey your parents. That's an action. Obey. Listen, you cannot be obedient to God. Listen to me. You cannot be obedient to God and be disobedient to your parents. It doesn't work that way. If you're disobedient to your parents, you're being disobedient to God. If you claim to be obedient to God, then you will be obedient to your parents. Listen to me, students, as bad as you want to think this, you don't know everything. Let me give you more news. Your parents don't know everything, but they do know more than you do. But they don't know everything either. I remember a good friend of mine, when he was parenting his son is grown now and has children of his own, but I remember a specific instance when he was getting on his son, and boy, his son really lashed back at him and said, and they were in a dispute, and the father finally looked at me and said, listen to me. You're my oldest, and I've never done this either. So I might make some mistakes also. I don't know everything. But in this case, you're going to listen to me. Hey, listen, mom and dads, some of you need to put on your big boy pants and start being the man or the woman of the home and make the decisions instead of Johnny or Susie making decisions. Obey. But then a second word there, honor. Honor, the word there refers to the attitude or the motive behind the action. It was first mentioned in the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20 and verse 12, honor your father and mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. It's mentioned again in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 16, honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you so that you may live long and so that you may have prosper in the land the Lord your God is giving you. Then in Leviticus chapter 20, it takes it a step further. If anyone curses his father and mother, he must be put to death. I think they were serious. He has cursed his father or mother. His blood is on his own hands. Over and over and over throughout the Proverbs, we're told the same thing. This command is to honor one's parents appears 5 times in the New Testament. Honor your father and mother appears 5 times in the New Testament. By the way, honor your parents. That has nothing to do with age. There's a sad thing I see from time to time. I see grown adults, child grown, parent grown, and they won't even speak to each other. Won't even speak. Won't have anything to do with each other. Let me tell you what the Bible calls that. The Bible calls that sin. And whichever party is wrong, it really doesn't matter. Life's too short. Get it right. Get it right. Relationship problems. Life's too short. But children have an obligation to their parents. The second thing we see, God has an obligation to his children. Did you know that? That God has an obligation to us? Now let me explain that. Both statements in verse 3, though, are conditional for the child. If you honor and if you obey, if you honor and then you obey, God promises some blessings. Listen now, I've already said God has an obligation to his children. Listen, God owes me nothing. God owes me nothing. He's already done more for me than I could ever repay him in. God owes me nothing. Only what he owes me is what he's promised he will do for me. That's where God comes under obligation, when he promises he'll do something. When you call upon the name of the Lord and ask him to save you, he promises to do that. That's an obligation that God has to you. But God says, if you will obey and you will honor, I will give some blessings. God is not obligated to us unless it's something he has promised. 5 other, like I told you a while ago, 5 times in the New Testament, we're told to honor our parents. But this is the only place, right here in Ephesians 6 in verses 2 and 3, that a blessing is attached. What blessing, Pastor? Well, there's an old Chinese proverb that says, one generation plants the trees and the next gets the shade. Let me show you in these verses. The original promise in the Old Testament was extended to Israel and involved tangible and physical and earthly blessings. Here in the New Testament, it's a little bit different. Look at that verse again with me in verse 3. That it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. There's 2 obligations from God right here. There's 2 promises of blessing, so that it may go well with you. That relates to the quality of life, not a promise of tangible blessings, but of intangible blessings. You say, what are intangible blessings? Peace, love, harmony, satisfaction in life. Listen, I'm only 43 years old, but the older I'm getting, I'm learning that all the stuff that I thought was so important in life really is not important anymore to me. It's not important to me. Let me tell you why. I love all of you this morning. I love most of you. I do love all of you. But let me tell you what, there's a little one sitting over here about 15 feet from me. I love him more than I love any of you. And if you're mad about that, I'm sorry. You know why? Because his last name is the same as mine. You know what? And all the stuff that I thought at 17, 18, 19, at 25, at 30, all the things that I thought were important, they don't mean near as much to me now as that does. What are you living for? God has an obligation to his child, so it will go well with you. You know what I want in life right now? I want those intangibles. I want those intangibles. I want peace. I want harmony. I want the love of Jesus. I want the peace of God. I want the peace with God. I want the peace of God. Those are the things that God has been showing me some hard lessons in. Those are the things that matter. So it not only said it may go well with you, he says that you may have a long life in the land. That relates to the quantity of life. The one who is obedient to God through obedience and honoring his parents, he is promised the full life that God has intended, unlike those who God took earlier, like Ananias and Sapphira. Now, let me tell you, can I tell you a problem I had with this passage this week? And I'm telling you, I had to study it and really think through this. I said, okay, God, if children obey their parents, you promise that their life will be long upon this earth. I had a father who, as far as I know, was a good kid coming up. I never heard any horror stories on him. I always heard that he obeyed my grandparents, his mother and father. I always heard that he was a very compliant child. He went to Bob Jones and prepared to be a pastor, and then pastored all his life, and then took care of basically not totally invalid, but a handicapped wife all of his life. And as far as I know, and in my eyes, I could not write down an order of a better father. Okay, God, now you're saying that if we honor our father and mother, which Sam Truitt did, why did you take him so early? At 58. I used to think 58 is old. I don't think 58 is so old anymore. Some of you think 58 is young, don't you? But hey, you ever thought something like this? Hey, can I just be honest? I mean, hey, here's something you need to know. I have those kind of thoughts too. And I'm saying, okay, God, I don't know that I understand this. You took my dad and my mother at young ages. They honored their parents, both of them, as far as I have any idea. But you know what this passage says? God, when they were born, knew when they were going to die. He had it all in his plan, and he had it all worked out. That was not the case with Ananias and Sapphira. God took them. God killed them. God promises, if I obey my parents and honor my parents, I will get the full life that God has planned for me. You know what? God can take you. You know, that ought to scare the shoes off of you. If I was still preaching in Johnson County, I'd say it scared the pants off of you. But that ought to scare you, that God could take you. God has an obligation to his children. Last point, parents have an obligation to their children. I'm going to spend a very short time because I've run out of time here. The negative of that command is, fathers, don't stir up anger in your children. John MacArthur says in the pagan world of Paul's day, and even in many Jewish households, most fathers ruled their families with an iron fist. And they were stern and hard. And Paul makes it very clear that the father in that family is authority, but he's not to rule in cruel and evil and mean ways. Fathers, don't you abuse your rights as a father. Let me tell you, there's never a time when a man should abuse a child. Never. Then there's a positive to that. Bring them up in training and the instruction of the Lord. Listen, discipline and instruction which brings a child to respect the commands of the Lord as a foundations of life and godliness and has blessings. The problem with our culture is today, people and our society have said you can't discipline your children. And then we as parents, we get lazy. And we get scared, and then we start adopting the world's view on how we should discipline our children instead of the Bible's view on how we should discipline our children. Let me tell you where to go to find out how to parent. Right here. Right there. Now, there's some other great resources and great books written by people who have studied this book. People like James Dobson and people like Dennis Rainey, and there's others that I listen to as well. They study the book. But listen, if you're getting parenting advice from people who don't study the book, you're going to the wrong well. Listen, kids need love and affection and tender care, but they also at times need discipline. This is original with me. You can quote me if you want to. The law says you're innocent until proven guilty. My dad said you're guilty until I find out you're innocent. Here's a question I get. Chris, how can I know that they won't stray? Let me give you an answer. You don't. Let me give you some examples out of Scripture. Rehoboam was the father of Abijah. A bad father begat a bad son. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, let me give you another example. Then Abijah was the father of Asa. You following this now? He was a bad father who begat a good son. Look at the next generation. Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat, a good father who begat a good son. All this is in the scriptures right there in 1 Kings. Then Jehoshaphat was the father of Jehoram, a good father who had a bad son. Here's what I'm telling you. There is no guarantee that our children will turn out like we want them because they have a free will. But listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. The percentages are much, 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 much higher if we will be diligent to train them and teach them the commands of Almighty God. One commentator said this: ultimately, the concern of parents is not simply that their sons and daughters will be obedient to their authority, but that through the godly training and admonition, their children will come to know and obey the Lord Himself. You can't guarantee how a child's going to turn out. I have heard preachers say the opposite of that. Let me just tell you, according to the examples that I gave you in the Bible, they're wrong. I'll close with this. You would know the name Al Capone. Al Capone was a famous name, but not famous for good reasons. Al Capone virtually owned the city of Chicago. He was involved with the mob, and he was not famous for anything heroic, but he was notorious for filling Chicago with all the evil that he could. How did he ever stay out of jail? We have no idea, but there is an idea. He had an incredible lawyer that kept keeping him out of jail. His name was Easy Eddie. He was excellent at keeping his boss out of jail and keeping the mob safe. Eddie lived a high life and cared for very little for a long time. The story says that Eddie had one soft spot in his heart. And that soft spot was for his own son. He gave his son everything, every monetary thing that could be bought. Easy Eddie bought that son. He did everything for him. And he even tried to teach him right from wrong. He wanted his son to be better than him. And yet with all his wealth and influence, there were two things he could not pass on to his son. He could not pass on to him a good name or good integrity. Easy Eddie made a difficult decision one day. He turned on Al Capone and the mob and testified against them in court. Less than 1 year later, I think it was actually just a few months later, Easy Eddie was murdered because he had turned on Al Capone and the mob. His life was over. In World War II, there was a group of fighter pilots under the command of a guy by the name of Butch O'Hare. He was a fighter pilot assigned to the aircraft carrier Lexington in the South Pacific. One day, his entire squadron was sent out on a mission. After they were airborne, O'Hare or Butch realized they hadn't topped off his fuel, and he didn't have enough to go do the mission and get back safely to the aircraft carrier. He had to abort the mission, and his men went on. When he aborted the mission, on his way flying back, he encountered several Japanese planes that were headed to attack his squadron that was going that way. They were in fast pursuit. Eddie radioed in and told him what was going on. He commenced to fire on those planes by himself and even flew straight into him, clipping some of their wings and disarming those group. And those that were left, they veered off and went another way and saved his squadron from an attack. Not long after that, at the age of 29, Butch O'Hare was killed in action. His hometown would not allow his memory to fade. And today, his memory still lives by the name of O'Hare Airport in Chicago. He learned integrity. I forgot to tell you part of the story. Butch O'Hare was the son of Easy Eddie. I just thought you ought to know the influence of a father. Even if you've been wrong and wrong and wrong, it's not too late to make it right. How are we going to raise a generation of champions? Will you bow your head this morning?